Everyone in the neighborhood knew the woman with the two large dogs. They joked that she was overprotective and that her dogs were too clingy because they never left her side. What they didn't know, and what the woman was only beginning to realize, was that her dogs weren't clingy. They were standing in the gap between her and a predator who had been mapping her route for months. This is the story of the danger you don't see and the protectors who do. If you've ever noticed animals changing their behavior long before danger shows itself, stay with this. And if quiet, real-life dog protection stories matter to you, subscribe, because this one only makes sense once you hear what they were shielding her from. She walked her dogs every morning and at the same time. Same route, same pace, same quiet streets before the day woke up. People thought it was routine. Neighbors waved from porches. Joggers passed her without a second glance. Shop owners recognized her dogs before they recognized her. Two large dogs, calm, disciplined, always walking just a little too close to her legs. Too close for comfort, some said. They don't give you space, someone once joked. They're trained, she replied, and left it at that. What no one noticed was when they closed in. Not at intersections, not when cars passed, not when strangers waved. They tightened their formation when the street felt empty, when footsteps echoed too long behind them, when a shadow lingered where it shouldn't. They never pulled, never barked, never made a scene. They adjusted. People mistook that for obedience. It wasn't. She had started walking with them years earlier, after something happened that she never talked about. Not because she didn't want sympathy, but because explaining it always sounded exaggerated out loud, too dramatic, too unlikely. So she stopped trying. Instead, she kept walking. At first, the dogs were just company, comfort, noise against the quiet. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, their behavior changed. They began choosing sides of the sidewalk without being told, slowing down at certain corners, stopping entirely in places that looked no different than the rest. Once, when she tried to urge them forward, one of them sat, planted, refused to move. She laughed it off at the time. "Come on," she'd said, tugging gently. "You're being dramatic." The dog didn't move. That was the first time she felt it again. That tightening in her chest. That sense of being watched without seeing anyone watching. She turned around. Nothing, just an empty stretch of sidewalk in the early morning quiet. The dogs relaxed immediately. They walked on. After that, she started paying attention. Not to the street, but to them. How their ears angled before she noticed anything wrong. How their bodies shifted subtly closer to her legs. How one always took the outside position while the other stayed nearer to her side. She stopped listening to music on walks. Stopped taking calls. She learned their signals instead. Most mornings passed without incident. That's what made it easy for everyone else to miss. Protection doesn't announce itself when it's working. It blends in, looks boring, looks routine. People only notice danger when it's loud. The dogs knew better. They had learned what she hadn't told anyone. They had picked up on patterns she tried to ignore, and every morning, without fail, they prepared for something that hadn't happened yet, but might. Neighbors saw a woman walking her dogs. Joggers saw a familiar face. No one knew that those walks weren't about exercise. They were about control, about safety, about getting through another day without being followed. And most importantly, they didn't know what would have happened if she'd ever walked alone. She left the house just before sunrise, the way she always did. The streetlights were still on, casting long yellow shadows across the pavement. The air was cool enough to wake her fully before the day had a chance to catch up. The dogs stepped out ahead of her, leashes slack, bodies loose but alert. They didn't pull. They never did. From the outside, it looked like discipline, training, a routine built through repetition. In reality, it was something else entirely. The dogs paused at the end of the driveway, noses lifting briefly before they stepped onto the sidewalk. One moved slightly ahead, the other stayed close to her left side, shoulder brushing her leg just enough that she felt it. That was normal. She followed the same route every morning, down the main road, past the closed shops, through the narrow stretch where houses pressed close together, and then back again before traffic picked up. People asked why she never changed it. She never answered. The dogs chose the pace. At the first intersection, one slowed, glancing back at her before stopping completely. The other angled his body outward, placing himself between her and the open street. She waited. A car rolled past faster than it should have, tires hissing against damp asphalt. The dogs didn't react. When the sound faded, they moved on. She trusted that. Further down, the sidewalk narrowed where a fence leaned inward. The dogs shifted closer, tightening the space around her. One stepped half a pace behind, eyes scanning the stretch ahead. She didn't look around. She didn't need to. She knew this part of the route. A neighbor stepped out of their house, surprised to see her so early. "Morning," they called. She smiled and nodded. The dogs relaxed slightly, but didn't break formation. "Your dogs are always so serious," the neighbor joked. She laughed softly. "They like the quiet." What she didn't say was that they liked predictability. The dogs stopped again near the alley entrance, halfway down the block. It was narrow, shadowed, the kind of place sound lingered longer than it should. One of them sat, the other stood rigid, ears forward. She halted instantly. She didn't urge them forward. She didn't speak. She waited. Seconds passed, then footsteps echoed from somewhere inside the alley. Slow, deliberate, not heading out, just shifting position. Someone lingering. The dogs didn't bark. They didn't growl. They simply held their ground. The footsteps retreated deeper into shadow. Only then did the dogs move again. Her heart didn't slow until they were well past it. By the time the sun crested the rooftops, people began to appear. Joggers, cyclists, a woman pushing a stroller. The dogs loosened, spacing themselves out more naturally. She exhaled. That was the pattern. Tension when the world was empty, ease when witnesses arrived. No one noticed the difference but her. Once, months earlier, she had tried walking later in the morning instead. Just to see, just to prove to herself that the dogs weren't necessary. They had refused to leave the driveway, planted their paws, sat, wouldn't budge. She laughed then, embarrassed, tugging at the leashes. "Come on," she'd said. "You're being ridiculous." One of them had looked up at her, not anxious, not stubborn, just steady. She hadn't tried again. Today's walk ended without incident. It usually did. That was what made the dog's behavior so easy to dismiss. Protection that works looks like nothing happened. She returned home as the street filled with sound. Doors opening, cars starting, the day beginning. The dogs relaxed fully only once the door closed behind them. She unclipped the leashes and watched as they moved to their usual spots. One near the window, one near the door. "Good boys," she murmured. They didn't wag, they had done their job. Later that morning, someone asked if she ever felt nervous walking alone so early. She shook her head. "Not really." It wasn't a lie, she wasn't alone. The dogs had already mapped the threats she pretended not to think about. They had learned the rhythm of the street, the spaces where people lingered, the times when quiet meant vulnerability. She didn't need to know what they were protecting her from yet. She only needed to trust that they were. And every morning as the sun rose and the world filled back in, they walked her safely through a stretch of time no one else even noticed was dangerous. People started noticing her dogs before they noticed her. Not in a suspicious way, just curiosity. Two large dogs walking in perfect control, always positioned, always alert without appearing aggressive. They stood out on a street where most people rushed through with headphones in, eyes down, minds elsewhere. "She's lucky," someone once said to another neighbor. "Walking two dogs like that, nobody would mess with her." That wasn't why they stayed close. She learned that the hard way. It started with small things. The kind you dismiss because nothing actually happens. A man who appeared 3 mornings in a row at the same corner, always pretending to tie his shoe when she passed. The dogs slowed every time they saw him, tightening their formation, one drifting slightly behind her instead of ahead. She noticed. She said nothing. On the 4th morning, the man wasn't there. The dogs relaxed instantly. Another time, a car idled too long at a stop sign that didn't need stopping. The engine hummed, low and patient. The dogs stopped walking altogether, forcing her to halt in full view of the streetlight. The car drove off moments later. People would have called that coincidence. She didn't. Neither did the dogs. They began choosing which side of the street to walk without prompting, sometimes crossing early, sometimes refusing to cross at all. Once, when she tried to steer them the other way, one sat down hard enough to jolt the leash from her hand. She let go. They waited. A man stepped out from between two parked cars ahead. Too fast, too sudden. He froze when he saw the dog standing alert, bodies squared, eyes locked. He changed direction without a word. Her heart didn't slow until he disappeared. The dogs didn't react after that. They had already neutralized it. That was the pattern no one saw. The dogs never responded after something happened. They responded before. People who saw them thought they were obedient. People who walked past them thought they were calm. People who commented thought they were trained for show. None of them noticed how often the dogs changed her route by inches, by seconds, by pauses long enough for someone else to pass first. Once, a jogger ran up behind her unexpectedly, breath loud, footsteps fast. The dogs reacted instantly, one stepping outward, the other pressing closer to her leg, forcing her to stop. The jogger startled, slowed, raised his hands. "Sorry," he said quickly. "Didn't mean to scare you." She nodded, heart racing. The dogs relaxed once he passed. Later, someone told her she should socialize them more. "They're too protective," they said lightly. "It's not healthy," she smiled politely. They didn't understand the difference between aggression and interruption. One morning, she took a slightly different route without thinking. Just one street over. A shortcut. The dogs hesitated immediately. One refused to move forward. The other circled behind her and nudged her calf firmly. She stopped. She stood there, torn between logic and instinct. "It's fine," she said aloud, mostly to herself. The dogs didn't agree. She turned back. That afternoon, she learned there had been an incident on that street that morning. Someone grabbed, someone screamed, someone ran. She sat on her couch and stared at the floor for a long time afterward. One dog at her feet, the other at the door. She didn't cry. She felt something colder than fear. Understanding. From then on, she never argued with them again. People noticed how rarely she walked without daylight, how she avoided shortcuts, how she never lingered at quiet corners. They thought she was cautious. She wasn't. She was informed. The dogs had given her a map of danger that never appeared on any screen, a map built from scent, timing, tension, and experience. One built from noticing when someone slowed to match her pace, when footsteps echoed too long behind them, when silence felt heavy instead of empty. She didn't know exactly what they were protecting her from, but she knew it was real. One morning, a neighbor joined her for part of the walk. They chatted casually, laughing, distracted. The dogs stayed close but relaxed. As the neighbor peeled off toward their house, the dogs tightened immediately, shifting position. The neighbor noticed and laughed. "Guess they like me." She didn't laugh back. Halfway down the next block, she felt it again. That familiar pressure in her chest, the sense of being watched. The dogs slowed. She stopped. Someone stood at the far end of the street, pretending to check their phone. Not moving, not walking away. The dog stood firm. A car turned onto the street, headlights flaring briefly. The person vanished between houses. The dogs moved on. Later, the neighbor texted her. "That was weird. Your dogs got serious all of a sudden." She typed back and erased it twice before sending. "They always know." The dogs didn't bark. They didn't growl. They didn't need to. They made space where danger wanted closeness. They bought time where harm needed speed. They kept her moving through mornings that looked ordinary to everyone else. And each day she walked back through her front door unharmed, she knew something most people never realize. Nothing happening doesn't mean nothing was there. It just means someone stopped it in time. It happened on a morning that should have been identical to every other one. Same hour, same sky, same quiet streets holding their breath before the city woke up. She clipped the leashes on by muscle memory and stepped outside without thinking. The dogs paused at the threshold like they always did, noses lifting, bodies loose but alert. Then one of them stopped. Not a hesitation. A full stop. The other dog shifted instantly, moving closer to her leg, shoulder firm against her knee. She frowned. "What is it?" Neither dog looked at her. They were listening. The street looked normal, street lights still glowing. No cars, no voices, just the distant hum of something waking far away. She waited. Seconds passed. The dog ahead took one slow step forward, then stopped again, ears pinned forward, tail still. The second dog moved behind her this time, changing their usual formation. Her chest tightened. "Okay," she whispered. "We'll wait." The dogs didn't relax. They didn't advance. They didn't retreat. They stood like they were braced against something invisible. She turned her head slowly and scanned the street. Nothing. That was when she noticed the sound. Footsteps, not behind her. Ahead, soft, measured, coming from the direction they were supposed to walk. The dog stiffened. One angled outward, body squared to the street. The other pressed closer to her leg, grounding her in place. The footsteps slowed, then stopped. A figure stood near the bend in the road, partially hidden by a parked car, close enough to see, far enough to pretend it wasn't intentional. Her heart started to race. The dogs didn't bark. They stepped forward together, one pace only, then stopped again, forming a tight line in front of her. The figure shifted. She felt it then, unmistakably. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't someone passing through. This was someone waiting. She didn't move, neither did the dogs. Seconds stretched. The street remained empty except for the three of them and the figure by the car. The dog's posture changed subtly. Lower center of gravity, weight balanced, eyes locked. The figure took a step forward. The dog stepped forward too. Not aggressively, assertively. The figure froze. She felt her breath catch. The dogs held their position, bodies calm but unyielding. Like a closed door that doesn't slam, it simply refuses to open. The figure glanced around, finally noticing the emptiness of the street. No witnesses, no cover. The dogs didn't need to bark. They didn't need to growl. They were enough. The figure took a step back, then another, then turned away entirely and walked fast in the opposite direction, disappearing around the bend. Only after the sound of footsteps faded did the dogs relax. They stepped back toward her, tails lowering, posture easing. Her knees shook. She hadn't realized how rigid she'd gone until it passed. She crouched and pressed her forehead briefly against one dog's neck, then the other's. "Thank you," she whispered. They accepted it without ceremony. They turned and led her back toward home without question. She didn't argue. Inside, she locked the door and sat on the floor, leashes still in her hands. Her heart pounded long after the house was quiet again. She understood something then that she hadn't allowed herself to fully face before. The dogs weren't just preventing random threats. They were responding to a pattern that had finally decided to act. Duet. If you've ever trusted your instincts and later realized how close you came to something worse, pause here. These stories exist because noticing patterns can save lives. If you're listening and you haven't subscribed yet, consider it, because the rest of this story explains why those instincts mattered. She didn't walk the dogs again that morning. She didn't need to. Later that day, she replayed the moment again and again in her head. The way the dogs had stopped before she heard anything. The way they'd advanced without panic. The way the figure had retreated without a word. Nothing dramatic had happened, and yet everything had. She called a friend and tried to explain, but the words sounded thin, incomplete, like trying to describe a sound you feel more than hear. "So, nothing happened?" the friend asked. She hesitated. Something almost did. The dogs slept deeply that afternoon, bodies finally relaxed. She watched them from the couch, a quiet gratitude settling in her chest alongside something else. Resolve. The next morning she walked again, but later, busier, louder. She chose streets with open shops and early commuters. The dogs stayed close but relaxed. No tension, no signals. That told her everything she needed to know. She didn't change her routine out of fear. She changed it out of respect for what the dogs had shown her. From that day on, she adjusted her life in small, deliberate ways. Different times, different routes, more people around. Fewer quiet stretches where someone could wait unseen. The dogs approved. They rarely stopped her after that. The street felt lighter, but the memory stayed sharp. Because she knew this truth now, without doubt. If she had walked alone that morning, no one would have known why she never came home. And if she hadn't listened to the dogs all those months before, if she'd dismissed their signals as overprotectiveness, this moment would have ended very differently. Nothing had happened because something had been stopped. And the Max, calm and silent again, had returned her safely to a world that never knew how close it came to losing her. After the morning the pattern broke, she stopped pretending the walks were harmless. She didn't panic. She didn't hide. She adjusted. That was the difference. She began leaving the house later when the street had a pulse, when doors opened and closed, when people passed close enough that silence couldn't gather momentum. The dogs noticed immediately. Their posture softened. Their spacing widened. They walked like companions again instead of shields. It told her everything. Protection had never been about dominance. It had been about timing. The dogs had been compensating for emptiness. Now that emptiness was gone, neighbors noticed the change too. Sleeping in now, someone joked one morning as she passed by with the sun already high. She smiled. Something like that. They didn't ask more. The dogs didn't need to intervene anymore, but they didn't stop watching. They still chose sides of the sidewalk, still slowed near certain corners, still paused when something felt off. The difference was that those pauses were shorter now, more like confirmation than warning. The street had become safer because it was fuller and because she listened. One afternoon, she decided to test it, not recklessly, deliberately. She took the dogs out early again, but not as early as before 4. Dawn instead of darkness. Enough light to see faces, enough activity to create friction. The dogs stayed close but relaxed. They didn't stop her. That mattered. Halfway through the route, a familiar corner came into view. The alley where they had paused so often in the past. She slowed instinctively. The dogs didn't. They walked through without hesitation. Her chest loosened. Nothing had changed about the alley itself. Same shadows, same smell of damp concrete, same narrow stretch that swallowed sound. What had changed was the pattern. People passed by. A delivery truck idled nearby. A woman crossed the street with her phone to her ear. The dogs assessed and approved. She followed. Later that day, she sat on her couch replaying the morning in her mind. Not with fear, but with clarity. The dogs had never been reacting to places. They'd been reacting to conditions. Empty streets, predictable routines. Someone learning her timing. She broke the timing. The monks adapted. Days passed without incident. That alone felt strange. She realized how much of her life had been shaped around avoiding moments no one else knew existed. How often she'd accepted tension as normal because it was familiar. Now, mornings felt lighter. She still walked with awareness, but the constant edge was gone. The dogs noticed too. They slept more after walks, chose sunny spots instead of doorways, turned their backs sometimes, something they hadn't done in years. Trust had expanded outward. One evening she mentioned the change to a friend. "I think they were warning me," she said carefully, "for a long time." The friend frowned. "About what?" She shook her head. "I don't know exactly." "But you're sure?" "Yes." The friend nodded slowly. "Then you should listen." That was all the validation she needed. Weeks later, she ran into a neighbor she hadn't seen in a while. "Didn't you used to walk super early?" "Usually?" the neighbor asked. "I did," she said. "What changed?" She glanced down at the bums who were calmly watching a group of people pass ahead. "They told me to." The neighbor laughed, assuming it was a joke. She didn't correct them, because the truth didn't need convincing anymore. One morning while walking at her new time, she noticed someone across the street watching her. Not overtly, not aggressively, just long enough to register. The dogs noticed too. They didn't tighten, they didn't stop. They maintained pace and position, alert but unconcerned. The person looked away and moved on. That was the difference now. Threats dissolved instead of escalating. The dogs didn't need to form a barrier. Their presence alone was enough to deter what might have been. She understood then that the dogs hadn't just protected her physically, they had changed her behavior in ways that made protection easier. Awareness spreads outward, so does safety. One evening, As she unclipped the leashes after a walk, she paused and looked at them. "I know," she said softly. They didn't look back. They didn't need reassurance. Their job wasn't to be thanked. It was to be heeded. Later that night, she lay awake thinking about how close routine can come to becoming a trap, how predictability can invite attention, how silence can become an accomplice. She thought about the morning she might have walked alone, and then she didn't. Instead, she reached down from the couch and rested her hand on the warm fur beside her. The dog shifted slightly, acknowledging her touch, then settled again. They had done what they were meant to do. They had carried her through danger she never had to name. Now they were content to walk beside her, not as shields, but as companions, knowing that she had learned the most important lesson they had been trying to teach all along. Listen, it took time for her body to believe what her mind already knew. Even after the routes changed and the mornings grew busier, she still caught herself bracing at certain corners. Her shoulders would tense, her steps would slow. She'd listen harder than she needed to. The dogs noticed before she did. They began checking her instead of the street. One would glance back at her face, the other would drift closer, not to block but to ground. A quiet reminder that the danger had passed, at least for now. She let herself trust that. But trust doesn't erase memory. Some mornings, when she stepped outside and felt the air settle around her, she remembered how long she'd been walking on instinct alone. How many times she'd sensed something off and kept moving anyway because stopping felt dramatic. The dogs had stopped for her. They'd carried the burden of noticing when she couldn't afford to. That realization sat heavy. One afternoon, she met a friend for coffee near the end of her route. The cafe was busy, voices overlapping, chairs scraping, life loud and ordinary. The dogs lay under the table, relaxed. "You look different," the friend said, studying her, "lighter." She smiled without thinking. "I feel different. Did something happen?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "Something almost did." The friend waited. She took a breath. "I think I've been followed. Not once, not obviously. Over time." The friend's eyes widened. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" She stared at the tabletop. "Because nothing ever happened." The dog shifted under the table, one lifting his head briefly before settling again. "That doesn't mean nothing was there," the friend said quietly. She nodded. Later, walking home, she replayed that conversation. How easily people dismissed near misses because there was no headline attached. No proof, no aftermath. The dogs had been her proof. She thought about the first month she'd walked early, how she'd ignored her own discomfort because it seemed unreasonable, how the dogs had filled that gap, noticing what she'd been trained to minimize. From then on, she started speaking up sooner. If a street felt wrong, she crossed it without apology. If someone lingered too long, she changed direction without explanation. She stopped worrying about seeming rude. The dogs approved. They didn't intervene as often anymore. They didn't need to. Her choices were interrupting the pattern before it formed. One morning, she passed the alley that used to tighten her chest. The dogs walked through without pause. A delivery truck idled nearby. A shop owner unlocked their door. The space felt neutral again. She exhaled. It wasn't bravery, it was balance. Still, the dogs stayed alert. They always would. They were older now, wiser. They rested more between walks, but their eyes never dulled. When something didn't belong, they noticed. She began to notice how many people didn't. Heads down, phones up, soundtracked lives. They moved through spaces assuming safety until proven otherwise. She understood why the dogs had stayed so close. Someone had needed to be watching. One evening, as she returned home at dusk, a man approached from the opposite direction. He slowed when he saw the dogs. His gaze flicked from her to them and back again. The dogs noticed. They didn't stop. They didn't tighten. They maintained pace and position, confident. The man hesitated, then crossed the street. Nothing happened. That was the point. Protection had shifted from confrontation to deterrence. Later, as she unclipped the leashes, she knelt and rested her forehead briefly against one dog's shoulder, then the other's. "I know what you did," she whispered, "even when I didn't." They accepted it quietly. If you've ever realized, after the fact, how much someone else carried for you, how many moments they stood watch so you didn't have to, pause here. Stay with this story, and if it resonates, consider subscribing. These are the kinds of truths we don't hear often enough. That night, she slept deeply. No dreams, no bracing. The dogs slept too, stretched out in their favorite places, bodies loose, breathing slow. Morning came and went without incident. So did the next, and the next. Safety, she learned, doesn't always feel like relief. Sometimes it feels like the absence of pressure you didn't know had been constant. She still walked. She always would. But now the walks felt like movement again, not vigilance. The dogs remained by her side, not because they had to, but because they chose to be, and because they knew something she had finally accepted. Protection isn't about fear. It's about attention. And attention, once shared, becomes strength. The day it almost caught up to her didn't announce itself with tension. That was the problem. It felt normal, too normal. The kind of morning that invites complacency. The sky clear, the air mild, the street already alive with early traffic. She clipped the leashes on and stepped outside without the familiar tightening in her chest. The dogs walked loose at her sides, not relaxed, just neutral. They reached the first corner without slowing, crossed the street without hesitation, passed the cafe where a delivery driver unloaded crates and nodded at her in greeting. Everything looked approved. Halfway through the route, she noticed she was thinking about something else, a message she needed to answer, a meeting later in the day. Her mind wandered for the first time in weeks. The dogs noticed. One drifted closer, the other adjusted outward, widening their protective arc without stopping her. She came back to herself. Sorry, she murmured, more to them than to anyone. They kept moving. At the long stretch near the park, open, bright, deceptively safe, she slowed instinctively. The dogs didn't. They walked forward, posture steady. She followed. A man appeared ahead, exiting the park path. He wore running clothes, earbuds in, gaze unfocused. He slowed when he saw her, then removed one earbud. Morning, he said. She nodded. The dogs passed him without reaction. That should have been the end of it. She took 5 more steps. Then the dogs stopped. Both at once, not a pause. A stop. Her heart jumped. She turned back. The man had turned too. He stood a few paces behind her now, earbuds out, attention fixed. The dog shifted instantly, one step backward toward her, pressing into her leg. The other turned fully, placing himself between her and the man, body squared. She felt the air change. Can I help you? She asked, keeping her voice level. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. You dropped something. I don't think so, she said. The dogs didn't bark. They didn't growl. They stood. The man took a step closer. The dogs stepped forward together, one pace only, reclaiming the space. The man stopped. His smile faltered. Easy, he said, holding his hands out slightly. The dogs held their ground. She felt the old pressure return, sharp and immediate. The realization landed with cold clarity. This was how it would have started months ago. Casual, plausible, quiet. She didn't move. Neither did the dogs. A car drove past, close enough to break the stillness. The man glanced at it, then back at the dogs. They're intense, he said lightly. She didn't answer. The dogs didn't blink. Another car passed, then a cyclist. The man took a step back. Have a good one, he muttered, turning away. The dogs watched him leave until he disappeared around the bend. Only then did they relax. Her knees shook. She took a breath she hadn't realized she was holding and crouched, hands resting on warm fur. Good, she whispered. Thank you. They accepted it without fanfare. They turned and continued the road as if nothing had happened. That was the hardest part. Nothing had happened, and yet everything had. She walked the rest of the way home in silence, replaying the moment with clinical clarity. The timing, the distance, the way he'd closed the gap only after she passed him. The dogs had waited for confirmation. They always did. At home, she sat on the floor and let the adrenaline drain. The dogs lay nearby, calm now. Their job complete. She understood something then that she hadn't fully grasped before. The danger hadn't disappeared. It had adapted, and so had she. She changed her route again that week, added variability, walked with intention even on busy mornings. The dogs approved. Their posture stayed easy. Their interventions rare. But the lessons stayed sharp. Patterns don't announce when they resume. They test first. Later, she told a friend what had happened. The friend's face paled. "That sounds scary," she nodded. "It would have been, if you hadn't had them." She glanced at the teaks, now sleeping in the afternoon sun. "They weren't the only reason." "What do you mean?" "I listened." The friend smiled tightly. "I'm glad." That night, as she settled into bed, she thought about how close complacency comes to undoing hard-won awareness. How quickly nothing happening can lull you into forgetting why it stopped happening in the first place. The dogs slept deeply. They trusted her now, and she trusted herself. The next morning, the walk went smoothly. Busy streets, neutral signals, no interruptions. She smiled as she locked the door behind her afterward. Protection wasn't a one-time event. It was a partnership. And when it worked, the world never noticed. After that morning near the park, something subtle but permanent settled into place. Not fear, confidence. The kind that comes from understanding exactly why something didn't happen and knowing it wasn't luck. The dogs changed again after that. Not dramatically, just enough that she noticed. They no longer scanned every passerby with the same intensity. Their heads stayed lower, their pace steadier. They trusted her adjustments the way she had learned to trust their signals. They were no longer compensating. They were confirming. The streets grew familiar in a new way. Not predictable, but readable. She noticed which corners felt neutral and which required attention. She sensed when a moment needed interruption and when it would dissolve on its own. The monks mirrored her awareness. One morning, a man walked behind her for half a block. Not too close, not far enough to ignore. The dogs noticed immediately. They didn't stop. They didn't tighten. They slowed just enough that the distance changed. The man passed her instead, nodded and kept going. Nothing happened. She smiled faintly. That was the difference now. Threats didn't escalate because the window never opened. Weeks passed without incident. People began to comment less about the dogs. They were simply part of her now. Familiar, expected, unremarkable. That was a success. One afternoon, while returning home earlier than usual, she passed a group of teenagers lingering near the corner store. Loud, unfiltered, the kind of energy that can tilt suddenly. The dogs noticed. They didn't intervene. They adjusted her path by half a sidewalk's width, placing her slightly farther from the group without breaking stride. The teenagers barely looked up. She continued home. Nothing happened. That night, she thought about how often danger thrives on hesitation, on uncertainty, on people freezing because they're unsure whether they're overreacting. The dogs had never hesitated. They had given her permission to act early. She started extending that permission to herself in other parts of life too, leaving situations sooner, speaking up faster, trusting discomfort without demanding justification. The dogs approved. One morning, she overslept and considered skipping the walk altogether. The dogs waited patiently by the door, but their posture was relaxed. No urgency, no signals. She smiled and grabbed the leashes anyway. The walk was uneventful, as it should be. At the halfway point, a woman stopped her to admire the dogs. "They're so well behaved," the woman said. "They look like they're on duty." She laughed softly. "They used to be." "Used to?" "They taught me what to pay attention to," she said. "Now I do it too." The woman nodded, unsure whether it was a joke. She didn't explain further. Later that week, she realized she hadn't thought about the early morning walks in days. The anxiety that used to sit just beneath the surface had loosened its grip. The dogs slept more during the day. They trusted the environment again. That was when she knew the protection had worked on a deeper level than she'd expected. Not just keeping her safe, but restoring her sense of control. One evening, she took the dogs out at dusk instead of morning. The light was soft, the street busy but calm, families returning home, doors opening and closing. The dogs walked loosely at her sides, tails low, posture easy. They weren't guarding. They were accompanying. She felt a swell of gratitude so sudden it surprised her. not for the moments they'd intervened, but for the ones they'd made unnecessary. She realized then that most people never know when they're being protected, because the best protection leaves no story behind. No memory, no proof, just continuity. The dogs had given her that continuity. Later, sitting on the couch with the ponies curled at her feet, she reflected on how easily things could have gone differently, how close routine had come to becoming vulnerability, how many mornings she'd walked through danger without a word being said. She thought about the morning near the park, the way the dogs had waited until confirmation, the way the man had tested and retreated, the way silence had followed. That silence wasn't absence. It was victory. If you're still listening, understand this. Most protection doesn't look heroic. It looks boring. It looks like nothing happening. And if that resonates with you, stay with us, because stories like this remind us what vigilance really looks like. The dogs lifted their heads briefly as a sound passed outside. A car door, voices. They assessed, approved, settled again. She smiled. She didn't need to check anymore. They were all listening now, together. The next morning, the walk was short and uneventful. Busy streets, neutral signals, no adjustments required. She returned home without thinking about it at all. That was the final proof. When protection works, it fades into the background. And the only sign it was ever there is how free you feel once you are no longer carrying the weight alone. It took a long time for her to put words to it, not because she didn't know what had been happening, but because saying it out loud felt like giving it shape. And once something has a shape, you have to admit how close it came. She had never been attacked, never grabbed, never hurt. That was the problem. People assume danger announces itself with damage, with proof, with aftermath. They don't understand how much work goes into making sure none of that ever happens. Her dogs did. They had been protecting her from patterns, from someone learning her timing, from someone watching without being obvious, from the quiet confidence that comes when no one ever interrupts. They had been protecting her from becoming predictable. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It came in fragments over weeks and months as the tension left her body and clarity took its place. One evening, while scrolling through a local community forum, she saw a post that made her stop breathing for a moment. Someone had written about being followed on early morning walks. Same area, same general time frame. Descriptions that felt uncomfortably familiar. Others commented beneath it. Nothing actually happened. Probably just paranoia. You should stop walking alone so early. She stared at the screen for a long time. Nothing had happened to her either, because something had stopped it. She closed the app and looked down at the peas sleeping nearby. Their bodies were relaxed now, stretched out in ways they hadn't been in years. They weren't on duty anymore. Not because the world had become perfect, but because she had changed how she moved through it. She stopped walking at times that left streets empty. She stopped repeating the same route without variation. She stopped overriding discomfort just to seem polite or unbothered. The dogs had taught her that. They had stepped in when she didn't yet have the language for what felt wrong. They had given her time to learn without paying the price for ignorance. People still asked sometimes why she never walked alone. She smiled and said, "I just like the company." It was easier than explaining that she had once been the only one walking those streets without witnesses, and that her dogs had refused to let her be unobserved. The final confirmation came quietly, the way everything important seemed to. She was walking one afternoon without the dogs. Just once, a short trip, busy street, daylight. She felt it again. That pressure in her chest, that subtle awareness of being noticed. She didn't wait. She crossed the street immediately, changed direction, entered a shop she didn't need anything from. Through the window, she watched a man slow down outside, glance in, then move on. Nothing happened. Her heart pounded anyway. She understood then, fully, what the dogs had been doing all those mornings. They hadn't been protecting her from one specific person. They had been protecting her from becoming accessible, from being isolated, from being easy, from being alone with someone else's intent. When she got home, the dogs greeted her with calm familiarity. They didn't question where she'd been. They didn't check her for tension. They trusted her now. That trust felt like the greatest gift of all. She knelt and pressed her forehead briefly into warm fur. I get it, she whispered. They didn't respond. They didn't need to. Years later, when she told the story carefully, without embellishment, people shook their heads in disbelief. But nothing ever happened, they said. She nodded. Exactly. They didn't always understand, but sometimes someone would go quiet, thoughtful, changed. Those were the ones who heard the message. The days lived long, full lives, walked thousands of miles beside her, slept through more peaceful mornings than tense ones. And when they were gone, the habits remained. Awareness, adaptability, trust in the quiet signals before danger needs a name. She still walks, still listens, still refuses to confuse nothing happened with nothing was there, because she knows the truth now. The safest stories are the ones where the ending never had to happen. She walked her dogs every morning, and no one ever knew how close she came to never walking home at all. If this story stayed with you, it's because you understand how real protection works. Quietly, early, without witnesses. If you want more true stories like this, where dogs step in before anyone else sees the danger, subscribe now. These are the stories that don't make the news because someone made sure they never had to.